Perfect. Thank you all so much for having me. It's good to be here. I'm calling in from San Antonio, so mostly local, but haven't been to Austin. I'll be up to Georgetown later this week. I'm going to share a link to the slides in the chat for afterwards, and I'm going to share my screen. And Florin or Jacob, do you mind letting me know when you can see my screen okay? All right, I got a thumbs up. All right, great. So again, my name is Tom Mock. I'm a product manager at Posit. We're an open source data science company. You might know some of our tooling such as RStudio or Quarto, Shiny for R and for Python. And I'll be talking mostly about Quarto today and using it with both notebooks and plain text inside of tools like VS Code, Jupyter Lab, and RStudio, just a little bit. So let's get this going. As far as like why you're here and what is Quarto, so I'll give you a little bit of overview about it, then show you some of the use cases and some of the ways you can use it for scientific communication. But first off, it's a free and open source tool. It's made for primarily scientific and technical publishing system. So using standard Markdown, similar to things like R Markdown or Jupyter, with additional features that are essential for scientific communication, as well as use for like within a company, right? Like it's not just aimed at academic use, but actually I use it a lot at work. And the slides I'm presenting today were actually made with Quarto. So using my own tool for today. It supports a number of different runtimes or computational backends. So Python, of course, is the one that's interesting today, but also supports tools like R, Julia, and observable JavaScript, which is made by the folks who made some plotting libraries in JavaScript. It bundles this together with Markdown and specifically Pandoc flavored Markdown with a bunch of enhancements to help with like typesetting documents, as well as, again, creating presentations, entire websites, manuscripts, dashboards, lots of different outcomes you can create. And these outputs can then be published or shared in locations. So not only can you write the document or write the presentation, but actually host it through tools like Quarto Pubs, which is a free service we provide. It definitely takes inspiration from tools we've built as well as tools that others have built, and we kind of are building off of this open source community and within the open source community. So you might have heard of tools like org mode or Weave inside Julia, or Markdown in R, or in Python, Jupyter, Jupyter Book, iPublish, and tools like that. So definitely a rich ecosystem here, but I'll try my best to show you a little bit why you might use this on top of something like a Jupyter notebook, or even do some things a little bit different than what you might be doing in a notebook. Again, the origin of this tool, it's sponsored by Posit PBC. We're a public benefit corp. We were formerly known as RStudio, but we now focus on both R and Python. So kind of wanted to differentiate that name a little bit. We had built the tool R Markdown for over a decade, and we knew that this was a powerful tool. Lots of people used it, but it really was very R focused. And we wanted to have a tool that was, agnostic towards a language. You could use it with Python, use it with Julia, use it for programming languages 10 or 15, 20 years down the road that are also interesting. It didn't want to be tied to a single language. So Quarto is this really ground up, like reimagining a rebuilding of our Markdown that's fundamentally agnostic towards the language and allows for different engines to be used alongside it. And of course, it's getting inspiration from our Markdown in Jupyter and making some kind of choices that go along with that, right? Like everything is a trade-off. And so there's an option of using pure IPython notebooks, as well as a pure plain text option that plays a bit nicer with things like version control, as well as like being able to edit it in different tools. The overall goal here, in really kind of summarizing, a computational document, right? A document that includes the source code for creating that document, allowing for both a notebook, an IPython notebook and a plain text, and allows for both interactive use as well as programmatic automation and like a reproducible pipeline. So you can actually take this and automate certain processes like creating presentations, creating websites, creating reports, in addition to using it for exploratory or data science tasks and things like that. There's kind of a fun idea here of like, of course, there's tools out there, there's Word, there's LaTeX, there's Markdown, and overall, it's just like there's this tension between how complex the tool is and kind of how much you have to learn, as well as like the difficulty of getting there, right? Like Word can be really powerful when you're first starting out, but then as you try to create more reproducible or complex Word documents, it's really, really hard. And then there's other tools like LaTeX or Markdown where, again, the sky's the limit as far as what you can do, but you kind of drop down into this really difficult syntax, or you're kind of cobbling things together. So Quarto is really trying to be this tool that makes life easier across the complexity curve, easy for easy projects, but powerful enough for more complex things like creating an entire website or a blog or a manuscript that you're submitting for a journal, or using it at work for reporting and analysis. Based off that goal, it's really around taking a single source and publishing it in multiple different ways, right? Like, you don't want to take one document and write it differently for PDF and differently for HTML and differently for a book and differently for a website. Like, that kind of is counter to what the goal is, which is from the same source, from the same document, I can create really any output that I want to create, right? So taking the same thing and rendering it out to all these different formats, which is what Quarto is accomplishing. I've got a simple example here. This is the plain text option, but again, you could have a Jupyter notebook. The core idea is that there's a YAML header. This allows you to define the metadata or the preamble of, like, what am I creating, right? Like, I'm creating a document that has a title, so matplotlib demo. What format am I using? HTML, and hide the code, but allow it to be expanded, so it's folding the code. And then again, because I can use different languages, I'm using Jupyter as the runtime, and I'm using Python 3 as the actual language that I'm working with. Then you supplement this with Markdown, right? So in addition to defining what you're doing, you also have enhanced Pandoc flavored Markdown, where you can do your italics and add pictures and integrate different things and do typesetting through pure Markdown in plain text. And then you have code chunks where you actually write your Python code. So here we have 3 backticks and then our tilde braces saying this is a Python chunk, so execute it as Python. And then you can write sub-parameters or sub-options to this chunk to modify its behavior. And I just do a really simple matplotlib graph, and it generates a document like we see on the right. Every component building into that in terms of Markdown, the YAML header, and the code chunks, that's really what Quarto is in terms of what you're writing. And again, while I'm showing like a Quarto document or a .qmd file, this would be identical essentially to what you would do in Jupyter Notebook, just you'd have different cells as opposed to the plain text. Importantly, that one document, while it created kind of like a static HTML output, it can actually be rendered to dozens of different output formats with Quarto bundling on top of Pandoc. So I could render that same document to HTML or PDF or to a Word doc or a publication, a PowerPoint, or like this presentation, Reveal.js, that actually allows for JavaScript and interactivity. That's a lot more robust than what I can do in a PowerPoint presentation. And of course, there's dozens of different formats. Like, it's not just reports, but even like entire books. There's the integration of like observable JavaScript and Shiny for Python, Jupyter widgets, all the interactivity you want, and even dashboards, which is something I use it for internally at work when we're doing reporting on, different customer data or what we're working with. There's a question around HTML be static, like the JavaScript option. You can have it either multi-file, right? Like where your JavaScript is split out and you have your CSS and your images, or you can do it as a single .html file if you wanted to, so it's a bit more transferable. So up to you in terms of how you want to approach that. So all this to be said, I'm 10 slides in. What is Quarto? Quarto is this open source scientific and technical publishing system built on Pandoc. And really, when you actually download it and want to use it, it's a language agnostic command line interface. It's just another CLI. So I can download it. I can do something like Quarto -- help. I have version 1.4 locally, and it has a few different major commands. I can render, which takes an input document like a notebook or a Quarto document, and then renders it out to the format I've chosen. Again, like HTML or presentation or PDF. Or I can do what's called Quarto Preview, which actually maintains a little web server in the background. So when I render, I can actually make changes, click save, and in real time, it updates the output, the view that I'm seeing, so that I kind of iterate across the document as I'm creating it. And it also has support for publishing, right? So you can publish to things like GitHub Pages or Netlify, or even Quarto Pubs, which is, again, the free tool that allows us to host content like what I'm showing you today. As far as the basic workflow, I've got some example code up here at my terminal. If I'm taking a QMD, I can just render the document. So Quarto render python.qmd, and it'll say whatever's in that YAML header, do that. Or I can say, oh, well, I actually had it at HTML, but I have to email it to somebody. So I'm going to render a quick PDF just to send it over to them. So I can say, render that file to PDF. Again, I can also use it with Jupyter Notebooks. It doesn't have to be this plain text option. If you really like notebooks, you can still use those. The difference being that you can either use the notebook as is, meaning don't actually re-execute it, just read the JSON blob that actually is a notebook as is, or you can say render it and also re-execute it linearly, right? Part of the benefit and kind of blessing and curse of Jupyter is you can render cells out of order, which is useful sometimes. So you don't want to you don't want to re-execute it because you actually executed cell 3, then cell 1, then cell 2. It was non-linear. And in other situations, you want to make sure it's actually reproducible. So you do want to re-execute it top to bottom. So you have that option depending upon your workflow. And it's almost the exact same, but with Quarto Preview, again, this allows you to execute the document, write it to disk, but then maintain that live view so you can interact with it and make changes to the document and see those in real time. I find that really helpful when I'm writing things like a presentation and I'm like adding a new slide, making some changes, adding a new slide, making some changes, and so forth. Again, while Quarto can use different languages and uses tools like knitr or knitr for R, we're really focused on Python today because this is a Python meetup. So it can natively execute Python code with Jupyter kernels such as IPython. You can choose, of course, there's like different variations of Jupyter kernels, and we also want to explore things like Mojo support in the future as like a superset of Python. And you can set the kernel that you want to use in the YAML. So in the YAML header, I give my title. I can say like, oh, use today's date when it's rendered. And then I'm going to use Jupyter, but I'm using a specific kernel I've created, right? I might have 10 or 20 different kernels on my machine that I'm switching back and forth between. Or if I'm inside like a virtual environment, I can just say use the default Python 3 that is discovered in my terminal from the sourced virtual environment that I'm activated in the terminal. And IPython will then execute the Python code, transform it into the output. So things like plain text or graphics you've created, Markdown, HTML, whatever. And then that is actually taken through and goes through the rendering process to create a final output through Quarto. For interactive sessions, Quarto will keep that Jupyter kernel resident kind of alive as a daemon to mitigate startup times, because sometimes it takes like 5 or 10 seconds to start up a kernel. So especially in these faster ones, you can have the kernel stay alive for that. Apologies, my dog is breathing heavily over here. I'm going to let him out. And we're back. He was too excited about Python. So again, I want to iterate, while you can still use a Jupyter Notebook, I think part of the value here is that you can use it as plain text. And I'm a big fan of plain text because I use a lot of GitHub and version control. And when I'm using notebooks and I make small changes, sometimes there's errors or trouble that you get into with managing the diffs. Not saying it's impossible. I still use notebooks, but plain text is plain text. And you can actually read the source and understand it, as well as use it interactively. So here I have an example of just comparing Python and R to kind of tell a story, in the sense of like, these are both going to be HTML documents, but I have a Jupyter engine running on the left with Python, and on the right side, I'm using R via knitr. I write some code, so it might be polars that I'm using in Python or dplyr in R, and I'm doing some data aggregation. Those parts are different. Of course, it's like Python code versus R code, but then all of the actual Quarto document itself, all the markdown, all the enhanced markdown, that is shared across whatever language, right? So maybe you collaborate with people that really only write a little bit of Python and mostly write SQL, or they write a little bit of R and you write a little bit of Python, or they use Julia and you use Python. You can actually collaborate with others and have them write in their preferred language, and in a project, render it all together with Quarto. So the Quarto goodness itself is shared across whatever language you choose. There's a question around static publication versus dynamic, like small Streamlit apps. There's a couple of great slides where I talk about the interactive components, both with server runtimes or all in the browser. So there's actually some like WASM support for things like Shiny, Observable JavaScript, or I think even HoloViz was announced recently. So there's a lot of different frameworks you can use for interactive documents as well. It doesn't have to be static. And just like it doesn't have to be static, it doesn't have to be plain text, right? Like the exact same workflows could be used for Jupyter notebooks. I have a YAML header, and the rest of the document is just a normal Jupyter notebook. So I can actually take an off-the-shelf Jupyter notebook that someone gives me, render it, and make this kind of beautiful report or this beautiful presentation out of it, or add in interactivity and distribute it however I like, right? Like maybe I use Jupyter notebooks, but I've got this buddy who's like, hey, I have to have a PDF because I have to use it offline or have to print it or whatever. Like you can really quickly hand off different components for different purposes. As far as that rendering pipeline, it looks a little bit differently depending upon what you choose. So in the plain text workflow, I actually use a Quarto markdown document or a .qmd file. It uses Jupyter to do the execution of the Python code. This generates an intermediary markdown file that's parsed through Pandoc and a bunch of Quarto on top of that, which renders out the actual final document. For Jupyter notebooks, when I'm using that as a workflow in say like a classic Jupyter notebook or Jupyter Lab, or even inside VS Code with a Jupyter notebook, actually just start with the IPython notebook and it's rendered through the Jupyter kernel there, and then it goes through and actually renders out to the final output. But either way is totally fine. And even within a single project, you might actually have like .py files, .jupyter, or sorry, .ipython notebooks, .qmd files, whatever. Like those can all be different within a single project that you're rendering out into a larger book or website. So what do I do with my existing Jupyter notebooks? Keep using them if you like them, right? You get to choose again whether to use that stored computation, like the actual JSON structure itself, or to re-execute the document linearly from top to bottom. That execute flag is what gives you the option to force re-execution and kind of make sure it's reproducible. But other times you get a notebook that someone else ran on their machine and you have no clue if it'll run on yours. You can actually render it into a different format with Quarto without having to worry about, can I actually execute this notebook? Because those are separate. Executing the notebook with Python, rendering it with Quarto. Quarto can also help with converting documents back and forth, right? Like if you like plain text or you like Jupyter Notebook, but your buddy doesn't, they like the opposite, you can actually convert the file back and forth from a plain text QMD to a Jupyter Notebook and back and forth, but either as making it as a copy or overwriting it in place as the other format. So again, trying to play nicely and integrate into Jupyter Notebooks as opposed to trying to replace them, right? Like trying to work with it. The last part I'll say, and then I'll get into a little bit more exciting stuff beyond just like what is all going on. There's this concept of like how Jupyter and how Quarto approach storing or freezing the computation in the reproducibility pipeline, both for like academic use, but also like at work. Like how did I actually get these results that I then have to go tell my boss or that affects our business, right? So Jupyter natively approaches this as storing the source code, the output file, and the cache within a single document, which is really powerful in some cases. Like the Jupyter Notebook itself is just a JSON structure that looks like HTML when you view it through a Jupyter Notebook interface. Jupyter Cache allows you to actually cache individual cells. So rather than the entire document, you could cache an individual cell for something that takes like a long time to run. You could store that execution temporarily as you're going through the rest of the document. Quarto takes a slightly different approach, which is called Quarto Freeze. This is intentionally a multi-file approach. You have your source code that can go into version control as plain text, QMD, or of course it could still be a Jupyter Notebook, but that's just the source, right? Like that's how you execute the code. Then you generate an output file, could be HTML or PDF or what other format you're creating. And then you have a freeze directory that is the actual computation. So this is the JSON structure that says for cell 1, store this. And this allows for permanently saving and reusing of computational outputs across an entire project, right? It's not just a single file, it's all the files in your directory if you choose. And it could be multiple QMDs, multiple IPython notebooks, multiple .py files that are all being stored with their computation. So you don't have to re-execute them. You're just re-rendering them to a different output format. So altogether, this is like the foundation of why I find Quarto exciting, is like easier to be reproducible, easier to work with source control, and easier to collaborate with some things, whatever the approach you take. What this also comes about is you're going to work with others, and you yourself might prefer different workspaces. You might love Jupyter Lab or Jupyter Notebooks, and that's the tool you want to use. It works with Quarto. Maybe you like VS Code and you use the Quarto extension for VS Code to actually run interactive cells within a plain text document and get that, rendered output out. Or you use a Jupyter Notebook and render it at the command line, or you want to use some other tool like RStudio, and you have some colleagues who use R code, and they can also write Quarto Markdown documents that y'all can work on together. There was one question around importing and converting from PDF into your format. Pandoc has some tools for actually converting PDF or HTML into Markdown, and then that could be edited. But Quarto itself does not import PDFs, right? It can bundle them or like attach them to a website or something, but it's not parsing them, although Pandoc could do that. Beyond just like a bunch of different tools, like there's even like NeoVim and some other mechanisms that you can use, or just using it via terminal where you can use Quarto. We've also enhanced it for use inside of IDEs. So both the YAML as well as code chunks have auto completion within RStudio and VS Code, because there are a lot of options. So especially in things like VS Code, there's this rich ability to like autocomplete names within the YAML headers, describe what the options are. And even in code chunks where you're like modifying the purpose of the code chunk and like, do I want to execute it? Do I want to show it in the document? Do I want to change the display of graphics or the alignment? I can do all of this minor control for typesetting and really tightly controlling my document, no matter what the language I choose. And of course, working in RStudio as well, but I think VS Code is probably a bit more interesting for this group. This also means for both Jupyter Lab, RStudio, and VS Code, there's also what we call the visual editor. So for Jupyter Notebooks, it's pretty lightweight. It just really changes some of the like markdown and handles it via Quarto. But in VS Code and RStudio, it actually gives you some word processing abilities directly in the plain text. Importantly, these don't hide, the source code, right? Like you're still generating markdown and can switch back and forth between a source document and the visual output with like all these different changes you can make, like insert a table, insert bullets, change bold, insert an image or whatever. You can switch back and forth between this kind of what you see is what you get and the actual markdown source code that you're working on. But it can make it a little bit less of a drag sometimes with more complex structures that you're trying to create inside of a markdown document, especially things like tables, where it's got like a nice table generator that's sometimes a bit tricky to produce by hand. If you heard my dog earlier, it's a Boston Terrier, so I always like to use this Boston Terrier example around, okay, well, I can create PDFs, I can create HTML, I don't get like why that's exciting. Let's say I have this report that I've borrowed from Wikipedia about how Boston Terriers are really cool. So I say, take this report and render it to HTML. But also take that exact same report and render it to PDF, right? Again, because I got to print it out for my mom or dad because they're like, oh, I don't know what a computer is or something. I don't know, like whatever they're doing. So both of these, without actually writing any HTML or LaTeX or anything else like that, can actually do proper typesetting for both of these different outputs, which couldn't be more different, right? Like HTML and PDF, sure, at some technical level, share some structure, but they're different languages. So here on the left, I have this lovely article that I've written in Quarto about Boston Terriers, again, copied verbatim from Wikipedia for this example, but it's got a table of contents that floats. It's got like hyperlinks and cover text for citations, and I've put an image with a description in the gutter of the document, pretty nice typesetting, right? Oh, but now I have to create a PDF. with the exact same source code, nothing else changed, I have a very similar document. Of course, limited to what you can do in PDF, right? Like you don't have interactive JavaScript that allows for a floating table of contents or hover text, but you still have hyperlinks and you still have typesetting and you still have the image in the sidebar. So the overall structure is the same. And that's really what Quarto is trying to do, is saying no matter what you're creating, you don't have to write raw HTML, raw LaTeX. You can, of course, like escape to that if you're doing something very specific and you don't care about other formats. But from a unified single document, you can create these other different outputs. And especially for things like HTML, it doesn't have to be purely static. You can integrate JavaScript or server-backed runtimes or other things into it through like IPy widgets and all sorts of different other things that make your document come alive and be interactive. So Quarto, with this unified syntax across both Markdown and code, especially for typesetting. So here I might take something like, oh, take these two Markdown images, right? And then I can use the syntax of what's essentially like a div or 3 colons and say layout number of columns equals 2. And it will take those 2 images with the label I've given them, Surus and Hano, for these 2 elephants, and then typeset them side by side. And again, this works in any format. It's not just HTML or PDF. It also works for Word documents and other outputs that you might create at work. And maybe I'm not taking images off my computer, but I'm actually generating graphics on the fly, right? Like I'm using Matplotlib or a tool like Plot9 to create graphics. So here on the right, I have very similar syntax, but now I'm in a Python chunk and I say layout number of columns equals 2, give them these captions of scatter and box plot. And now these graphics that were generated by code are also typeset appropriately within my document, no matter what the output is. So whether you're kind of bringing things you already have or generating with code programmatically, you can have this shared syntax you're doing across all the different things you're working on. Now, this becomes really exciting when you go beyond just like a boring example of like a static notebook. So we have things like Quarto manuscripts that actually allow you to write a full, multi-page web page essentially. So you have, of course, a single report, but then it also bundles things like a Word version or PDF or this Mecha bundle, which is used for scientific publication. And then it also has these source notebooks, which is saying like, hey, here's how I actually got these presentation results. These are the nuts and bolts of like how I did my analysis or how I came to this conclusion and how it affects the business, as opposed to the executive report that's showed here. But maybe you're not writing these complex manuscripts, right? Like you're actually using it more at work. You can just focus on like the notebook aspect and have it go back and forth so that when you're making business justification for why this like decision science experiment that you ran, why it affects your business in this way, you can connect the dots. So your technical colleagues can dive deep, but your executive or your other colleagues that are domain experts can just stay at the high level. You can, of course, create dashboards with Quarto, and this is really where some of the interactivity can continue to shine. So this is using Plotly on top of Quarto. So this is actually an interactive document where you have like layout of graphics and text and structures, tables, whatever you want to do, like a traditional dashboard. But you don't have to create this really long document. It's in a nicely formatted, simple notebook that you're working on. And that document might look something like this, where again, it's the same structure. I have a YAML header, then I have a code chunk of what I'm actually doing with importing my libraries. Then I have this quick little thing of saying like, oh, well, the row, I want one row to be 60% of the height, and that sets up that structure. Then I have some code to generate a graphic. And then I have 2 sets of graphics, remember at the bottom. So the second row is saying, for about 40% of the image actually include the 2 computational cells that created the lower section. If I go back, that was this, here it's taking up 60%, and then here's the other 2 images that took up 40. So in essentially no code, right? Like I'm just focusing on Python code, and I just add 2 lines, a row and a row. Now it's a dashboard, and I don't really even have to think about it in terms of like, oh, it's this really long document to create a dashboard. I can do it as like literally as I'm walking to present it to someone. I can just add those 2 lines and say, oh, now I have a dashboard. or you can go fully complex and build out a really robust, interactive dashboard that you're building and actually bring in an interactive runtime as opposed to Plotly being fully in the browser. Now, this interactivity, it's nothing if I can't actually show you it. So here in my presentation, I could also have interactivity, right? Like I can say, oh, well, here's, a toy data set, with this flower data, but I actually can bundle that into presentations. It doesn't have to be a dashboard or report. It can be any of these kind of HTML-based structures that I create. And you're not just limited to Jupyter widgets, which of course are really powerful, but we can actually add more on top of that. So we bundle a version of JavaScript or a JavaScript library called Observable, which is made by the same folks who originally created the D3 library in JavaScript. So by Mike Bostock and a company built around that. So this is another thing that it looks like a dashboard, right? But this is all run via JavaScript. It can communicate with Python, but it doesn't actually need Python. You don't have to install another library. It comes along for the ride. So it's still interactive in terms of I can filter, I can drop and add different things, and I can even display data in data tables within a presentation or a more complex report and have them interact with each other. So again, the interactivity here is really rich. I can also create these on the fly. Like this one's very structured around like, oh, it's a graphic that I'm adjusting it. It's very dashboard. But maybe I want to create a new widget that's like inline in a document. So I might have something like this where I'm saying, oh, well, what's 34 degrees in Canada versus what is the US, version, imperial and all the different conversions, whatever. So here I can actually interact with it, and inline in my text, I can actually get the changes in real time. And this is not much code, right? Like it's still JavaScript code, but it's very readable in the sense of like take an input range from 0 to 100. Each little chunk you moves at 1, a default value of 34, and then it pastes it almost with like a traditional kind of $ syntax that you'd expect of like, hey, take this and then it paste the updated text that's changing here from the slider, and it will modify itself in place across the document. So if you did want to go something more custom, this is just available for you to use if you use an observable JavaScript chunk in addition to Python, and you can actually pass data structures from like a file or a database you read in with Python and then pass that through into observable to do other cool things with it. The last part of interactivity I want to talk about, there's actually a tool we maintain called Shiny. So there's Shiny for R that's been around for a long time. We announced Shiny for Python, I think 1.5 or 2 years ago now. And Shiny Live is actually a way of doing it without a server runtime. So you actually have a WASM-based ability to work with it. So same thing, I still have interactivity, but this is all Python code running in my browser, right? It's actually converted over to WASM, so I don't have to have a server backend. I could actually have this be running on static hosting somewhere and still have that interactivity that I want with Python. This is a bit more complex in terms of the code I'm writing because it is Python and Shiny, but like same kind of structure where it's like I have a Shiny Live Python chunk. I import some libraries. I say from Shiny import these 2 modules, and then I lay out a structure of like what does the UI look like, and then define a server that again takes like some NumPy code and a matplotlib and graphs it, right? Like if I know Python, I can create a Shiny app and embed it inside of Quarto, inside of a presentation, or inside a document, or inside of a dashboard. And it doesn't have to have a server runtime or this kind of dependency hell that you have to translate between a server and a front end. So lots of interactivity that you can work on. And then as we get kind of closer to closing out, this is all really exciting, but even for the static use case, you can also use what we call parameters or parameterized Quarto. So maybe you're running a report and you run the same report 15 times with different inputs, or a different analysis with a bunch of different assumptions, or you run a report for Austin and San Antonio and Dallas, and it's really similar, but you can generate 3 novel reports out of that input. So in both Jupyter and other engines, we support these parameters where I can define something like tags and then parameters and say, oh, well, alpha is equal to 0.1 and ratio is equal to 0.1. And you can actually pass these at the CLI level, just as additional parameters to the render call, or you can actually have them in line and overwrite the text as you need to. And then these are accessible at kind of like the top level environment where you can use alpha in other definitions you write or other functions or objects and then modify them based upon these parameters that you've defined. And of course, we can do something similar in R, but I think Python is where we want to focus for today. As far as using these, again, like while you can do it inside of a document, that's not super exciting. It's really this idea of like from the same document, not only can I convert it to whatever format I want, but I can also pass parameters and change those on the fly to say, take this document, rerun it for today, or rerun it with these parameters or for this geographic region. And you can very quickly, iterate across a reproducible pipeline that you've created. If you have a whole bunch of parameters and it's too much to like write them out every time, you can also pull from a YAML file and say, hey, here's a defined structure of like 10 or 100 different parameters that you're modifying for like a machine learning pipeline or something more complex that has like a bunch of different options you're changing. Last thing, and then we'll get into summarization, is yeah, you can use this locally, but you can also publish it to a bunch of different free locations. So you can take a document, and like I've published it to QuartoPub underneath my handle. I can publish it to QuartoPub for free. I can publish it to GitHub Pages and also bundle the source code along with it. I can publish it to Netlify if I have a Netlify account, or one of our commercial tools called Posit Connect that allows you to publish things and distribute them within an organization with security and things like that. But essentially, if you're just trying to share things publicly, you can use these free publishing tools to get them out there and use it as like a portfolio or just as sharing or working with others. And then lastly, there's this idea of like Quarto tries to do a lot for you and be very, very friendly and try to do everything through Markdown. So you don't have to write HTML, you don't have to write LaTeX, you don't have to write random JavaScript. You get to focus on your language and Markdown. But we bundle a lot of different things to make that possible. So we have Bootstrap for CSS. We respect Sass variables for styling. We include LaTeX templates for a bunch of journals for academic publishing, as well as docx and PowerPoint templates for if you have like one that you use at work. Ultimately, you don't have to like write all these different raw things, but you can like integrate it with a Jinja template to modify the document and then render it. And in most situations, we try to say that you can rely on just the Markdown syntax as opposed to having to learn LaTeX and Quarto and Python. You kind of get to just stay within your Quarto ecosystem with Python on top of it. And then you can also write extensions. So if you see something, you're like, oh, it'd be really cool if Quarto could do this, you can actually write your own extensions on top of Quarto and distribute them as open source. So you can say like, oh, I want to respect font awesome within here. So you can actually drop those in line, or you want to style the cells in a custom way and actually add the source code on top of it. Or you even want to create your whole presentation format so you don't have to define a bunch of additional things. Like you can actually have your own version of Reveal.js that you're customized for your company or your styling or whatever. You can use that. So ultimately, it's a really powerful tool. I really enjoy it. I love giving presentations with Quarto because it's a lot of fun to write these. And it's an open source project by Posit, the company I work for. So if you want to contribute or you have questions or you want to try it out, you can go to github.com and download the CLI from Quarto Dev, or you can go to quarto.org to actually download it directly from there, as opposed to like the daily versus the public release. I think I have a little bit of time for questions. It's about 7:56, so happy if folks want to unmute at this point or type things in the chat. But thank you so much for the time, and I'll stick around here for a while.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. I always love these visual tools because this is the little things that make your presentations just look really nice and clean. Those are what make people listen. Half of your problem is like data science that the data scientists tell me is half of your work is actual data science. Half of it is making a presentation that's to sell your data science to people. So
100%.
I love to show them these tools.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome stuff.
I have a question. Do you have like a place that the community of Quarto hangs out? Like, do they like, people have Discord channel or something like this? Do you have something similar that
Yeah,
people can just?
there's let me get this pulled over real quick. I think I'm still sharing. So on one, there's the Quarto CLI on GitHub. There's a discussions panel in there. This is how we kind of allow the dev team to directly interact with community questions. I think the nice part about that is it's fully public, right? Like if you ask a question or if you don't even ask a question, you can learn from how others have solved things, right? So there's discussions that are either unanswered or answered, like what is as is, what is the typist version? Typist is one with like creating PDFs without having to do any LaTeX. It actually is like a completely different backend, but still allows you to create PDFs, which is really powerful because I don't like LaTeX, but sometimes I have to create PDFs. So the discussions pane is a big one for interacting with the dev team. They're not on a Discord today, but our Shiny team, our Shiny for Python team is on Discord. And I can get you a link for that later on.
I do have a question. So can you have some way to display like live data, for example, or you have something in production and you want to show it? I don't know, like what kind of, is there anything that would actually update the data live to the let's
Like
say
streaming the data in?
kind of streaming the data in? Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah. So Shiny can do that. I think typically when you're looking at streaming data, Quarto is providing the structure of how you present it, but then you'd be using like JavaScript or Python to directly integrate like a live data stream.
Got it.
The two thing I would say is that in Python, that's pretty straightforward. And I think Shiny especially does a great job of allowing for streaming data. That's hard for some other tools. Like if you think of, I think Streamlit actually does a full re-render to like get new data. So that can be pretty costly when you're, creating the structure over and over and over versus like with Quarto or with Shiny for Python, it can actually just take the Python function, communicate with like an API or a database and have the data stream in real time through Python.
Cool. That's pretty cool. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
There was a question in the chat. I'm not sure if we got there. Robert was asking if you can import or convert from PDF into the Quarto format.
Right. Yeah. So there isn't a way that like Quarto is not importing PDFs directly, but let's do this. Apologies. I know I'm Googling things live, but I know what we're trying to get to. So Pandoc actually has a way conversion tool that Quarto kind of builds on top of. Pandoc can actually take a input file like HTML or PDF and then convert it to something like Markdown or even a .txt file. So Pandoc can do that in terms of like converting PDF into Markdown, which is sometimes really useful. And then I know there's a bunch of like Python libraries and R libraries and other kind of implementations of them, usually in like Rust or C++ or something, that can actually read in a PDF as structured data and convert that into like an object that you're working with in memory if you wanted to go that route as well.
What do you need to actually present? Like, what are the basic installations you need to present?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just have to download Quarto and work with it, or do you have to have dependencies, or what do you need?
Yep. That's a great question. So it's what I would call batteries included. So if I go to quarto.org, get started, and I'll drop that in the chat. The only thing you have to install is the CLI, right? So we have it for all the major distributions across Linux, Mac, Windows, and a bunch of different flavors of Linux in some cases where it needs to be converted. But once you download that, it actually is then available like on your terminal, on your path. And so you can use it at the terminal, right? Like just using Quarto render, Quarto preview, and things like that. Or for specific tools like VS Code or RStudio or NeoVim, Jupyter, you can also download like an extension that makes the experience better for writing Quarto documents, right? Like the extension is not necessary. It just allows you to use the QMD as like an interactive notebook without having to convert all the way to Jupyter Notebook. I don't think we have an IntelliJ extension. That's a good question. I'll have to look into that, but you can still use it with any arbitrary text editor, right? Like even if I'm like, I can still write .py or .qmd files in any tool, and then I just at the terminal would do Quarto render. So if I were using like PyCharm or something like that, or another text editor, I can write my Python code, write my notebook, write my Quarto document, and then just at the terminal, Quarto render it or Quarto preview it.
It's okay, because we only use VS Code here anyway.
It's a popular one.
Yeah, I know that one.
Okay,
I have an actual question though. So I'm curious, what are you guys' thoughts of with PyScript? Like, I don't know. I know PyScript is in development. I don't think anyone really does anything with it yet. But what are your thoughts with it there? Because I know, well, it sounds like your Shiny is just, JavaScript runs on your client side.
Yeah. So, well, I guess this is not the major one. I'm going to think. So PyScript, as far as I know, is kind of like allowing you to run Python inside of your HTML. I think the Anaconda team is the main team behind it.
We've had them talk actually, so that's why I think about it.
So it builds off of WASM and Pyodide as like the structure. Shiny for Python is approaching it in a similar way, but structured around application development. I think where PyScript, I'm pretty sure it's compatible with any HTML, and your Quarto is generating HTML, so you should be able to integrate it. But the difference for Shiny is it's much more in line of like an application framework, more similar to like HoloViz, Streamlit, Dash, where you're creating the whole structure, as opposed to PyScript is like, oh, I'm able to bundle Python, a small amount of it directly within an existing HTML or with a team that doesn't know anything about Python, and they just do front-end development in JavaScript or HTML. So there's a lot of tools out there, and I think Quarto is trying to just be a nice way to structure a document, both interactive and static. And I'm excited about what all the different WASM implementations are doing in terms of like, oh, I already know Python. I don't have to go learn React or something to do cool things in my browser. I can do it myself. There's a question from Jared. Does Quarto use Shiny or is it independent? The Shiny implementation is independent. So it's again like an opt-in, just as if I wanted to use PyScript or I wanted to use HoloViz or Shiny, I can do that within Quarto, but it's not required, right? For certain interactivity, like if I want Shiny Live, which is how I was doing some of the WASM stuff inside of Quarto, like Shiny Live, this actually allows me to take Python and convert it into a browser-based runtime. So that's where I have like the example of being able to interact with this. And even though this looks like Python code, it's being converted to run in my browser. And similarly, like I can actually have examples.
This is all client side though, sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, this is all client side running in the browser. And I can actually do things like, let's do the max of Dune. I don't know, something like that, and run it, and it updates in real time, right? Because it's in the browser and there's no server backing it. It's transpiled or converted into WASM or however you want to think about that. But it looks like Python, like anything that's available through things like Pyodide or Shiny Live or PyScript, those can run in an HTML context, so I can bundle those into a tool like Quarto.
Sorry if I'm moving away from Quarto into Shiny.
No,
but,
that's fine. Yeah.
What about importing other like modules and libraries like NumPys and stuff? Like, how does that get I guess you have to package that onto the WASM.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't really know too much of how that works, but I feel like that would be like annoying if you let me just package my whole Hugging Face Transformers module, 10 megabytes, gigabytes packages.
Right. So I think that the important part to remember is that while with Quarto, I talk a lot about browser-based runtime where you do have to have packages that are converted, although there's like thousands of packages that have been converted, including NumPy, Pandas, like the SciPy stack have been converted. I'm sure there's like cutting edge transformer libraries that it's like they have not been converted over into WASM. Shiny also allows for a server-based runtime where you do have to have like a Shiny server backing it with Python, with traditional like environment management, with computation and CPU and RAM and whatever that shows you a browser, but it's communicating from a client to a backend. And in that case, it would be like any other application framework where it's interactive, but it's using a server to do the computation as opposed to only relying on the browser. But it can do either or depending upon your use case.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Awesome stuff.
Absolutely. Cool. Any other questions? I really appreciate that. It's always helpful. Like when you give a presentation and you have good questions. So thank you all for the questions so far.
I don't know. So who's your big like users? A lot of data science people, a lot of researchers, I guess.
Totally. Yeah. I think as a company, we're a data science company. Like we build tools for data scientists, both like IDE. So of course, like things like RStudio and, professional tools on top of that. But in the Python space, doing a lot of pure open source in terms of Shiny for Python, Shiny Live, Quarto. We were even building things like, if you remember ggplot from R, there's a plot9 library in Python now that brings ggplot syntax. Working with Wes McKinney, formerly of the Pandas group. So he's here doing a lot of cool stuff in Python now. So a lot of open source.
Awesome. Love that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, this is what you do as a data scientist, apparently, is what I was someone was explaining to me the other day. They just do presentations. They do some data science and then they present it.
Yeah, trying to affect the business. I think that's the end game is like, how do I use my model or my data or whatever to solve and create business value? Get there somehow. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. I think I want to save some time for George to go over that. But thank you again for all the great questions, for the opportunity to speak here. I'm around. I'm still on different social media underneath Tom Mock and happy to communicate in the future. So thanks for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.